Okay, so let's move on to the last part of fundamental factory, and this is called intervals. Okay, so I need to explain something to you. So in music, you have these distances. So we've already established whole steps and half steps, right? We know that a half step is from key to key with no keys in between. Whole steps always skip a key. Let me show you. So this is half step, C to D, right? This is whole step. You already got that down. You know your major scales as well. Now let's talk about intervals. So in music, we use these things called intervals. It's just a way to describe distance, right? From here to here. You don't always want to be saying 4 half steps, even though that would be correct. Like I taught you earlier from C to E, that is 4 half steps or 2 whole steps. But there's more shortcut ways to do it, okay? And this is when I'm going to introduce to you intervals, okay? And they follow just like the number system, but you have to say them a little differently. You don't say the second tone, you know. You say firsts, seconds, thirds, fourths, fifths, sixths, sevenths. Okay, when you get into intervals, you're going to start talking that way. Firsts, seconds, thirds, fourths, fifths. And let me teach you an easy way. Okay, from the first tone of any scale to the first tone of the same scale. So pretty much that's what we call unison. You ever heard a choir teacher say, let's sing that in unison? Everybody's singing the same tone, no distance. From the first tone of the scale to the second tone of the scale, that's called a second. Okay, so when I say what's the distance between the first tone and the second tone, you should say second. Okay, the distance between the first tone and the third tone of the scale, those are called thirds. Okay, first tone to the third tone of the scale is a third. Distance between the first tone of the scale and the fourth tone of the scale, well, you should get the gist now. Those are called fourth intervals. The distance between the first tone of the scale and the fifth tone of the scale, those are called fifth intervals, okay? Fifth intervals. The distance between the first tone of the scale and the sixth tone of the scale, those are called sixth intervals. And the distance between the first tone of the scale and the seventh tone of the scale, that's a seventh interval. Now, some of you guys that already understand this might say, well, Jermaine, you kind of left something out. I did. Okay, right now I'm being very generic. You have 2 types of intervals. You got generic intervals and you got specific intervals. Okay, but specific is never going to overwrite generic. That's why I always start with generic. Meaning, if it's a fourth, it's a fourth. You know, a lot of people mess up. They call thirds a fourth. And that's because they skip the generic side of it. First of all, you need to figure out if you're a boy or you're a girl. Then we can figure out other stuff and how to dress you and your emotional state and what you're going to do and whatever, you know, or girl, boy, whatever. You know, but first we need to figure out the core base. And that's why I start by saying this is a first or this is a second or this is a third. Now there comes a time, and I need to wipe my face, and I don't want to cut the camera off because I'm on a run. But there comes a time when you need to say major third or minor third or something like that. But you can never go wrong by saying it's some kind of third. So that's why I took you through that thing. Okay, now how do you know if something is a first, second, or third? How do you know a fourth, fifth, sixth? Well, here's how you know. Remember in the beginning, Fundamentals Factory, I took you through the alphabet. I told you it's very important that you understand and you know how the major scales always go up an alphabet ladder. Well, the same thing with intervals. If you think about it, how many alphabet letters are between C and C? How many alphabet letters are between C and itself? Think about it. 0. I mean, C and C, that's it. Or 1, not 0, but you know, itself. There's only one alphabet letter, C. That's it. How many alphabet letters are in this C and D interval? How many alphabet letters? C and D. So if you were counting the alphabet, how many alphabet letters? Well, you got C and you got D. That's why this is a second, because it has 2 alphabet letters, C and D. How many alphabet letters are between C and E? Well, you have C, you have D, but you're not playing it. Just because you're not playing it doesn't mean it's not in between, but it is encompassed in this interval. So you got C, D, and E. That's why we call this a third, C, D, and E. How many alphabet letters are between C and F? Well, you got C, you got D, you got E, and you got F. Even though you're only playing C and F, you're playing the boundaries, but you're still encompassing 4 alphabet letters. How many alphabet letters between C and G? Well, you got C, you got D, you got E, you got F. That's why we call this a fifth, and so on. There's 6 alphabet letters contained in this. There's 7 alphabet letters contained in the 7th interval. So when you want to be correct in naming your chords and stuff later on, if I tell you, name me a third away from D, well, you can't totally answer that generically because a third could be a number of things. But you do know it's some kind of D and some kind of F. You don't know if it's F sharp or F flat or whatever, but you know it's some kind of D, wherever this might be, and some kind of F. That's passing the generic test. You gotta have those, okay? It has to have 3 alphabet letters. In other words, a lot of people, when they're doing chords and stuff, they'll call this maybe a C, and they'll call this a D sharp. Remember when I said the black keys, you'll learn the purpose of them later, like whether to call it D or E? This is when you do that, okay? Because if I said I need a third interval between, these 2 notes, that should tell you what to call it. Because if you call this a D sharp, D and C only encompass 2 alphabet letters, C and D, that's it. But if you call this an E flat, now it's encompassed 3 alphabet letters because you got a C in the mix, you got the D in the middle somewhere in the mix because it's being encompassed, but now you have the 3rd letter, the E flat, in the mix. So remember that. It's something that you have to put your mind around, but with intervals, you gotta have those numbers in the middle of it. You gotta have those alphabet letters represented. And when you're premature, you wouldn't call this a D sharp. If you call this a D sharp and a C, or C and D sharp, this is a 2nd interval, some kind of 2nd, okay? But it's not a 3rd interval because you gotta use the E, some kind of alphabet letter E. You gotta use it. Okay, so now that you got your intervals out the way, let's talk about the specific intervals because this is important. Okay, so we got our generic intervals. With specific intervals, what's happening, and I'm just going to cover the main important ones. I'm going to cover thirds and fifths, okay? Thirds and fifths. Now, a minor third, you should know, that's what I was just playing. Minor thirds have 3 half steps in between them, okay? Write that down. Minor thirds have how many half steps in between them? 3, okay? And let's look at this. C to D flat, that's 1 half step. D flat to D, that's 2 half steps. And D to E flat, that's 3 half steps. So minor thirds have 3 half steps in between them. Major thirds have 4 half steps in between them. So minor thirds have 3 half steps in between them. Major thirds have 4 half steps in between them. So once you understand that, you would call this a minor third, major third. Major third, minor third. Okay? So that's 2 tests. Now there's 2 tests it has to pass. And you got this. Once you got this, you're good to go. 2 tests that it has to pass. Okay? If it's a minor third, it needs to also have 3 alphabet letters in the mix. So, when you subtract the alphabet letters, there better be 3. If you starting at C, you better end at some kind of E, because that's C, D, E. You're subtracting, bam, you got 3 alphabet letters. Okay? So it needs to pass the generic test. That's like when you throw up the marbles, it needs to pass that test. You can't even move on if you don't pass that test. And then the second test it needs to pass, specific, is how many half steps? Is there 3 half steps? Okay, now we're going to call it a minor third. If it matches, if it has the right letters in it and it has the 3 half steps, it's a minor third. If it has the right letters in it and it has 4 half steps, it's a major third. That's all you have to know for the purposes of this course. Okay, so we're going to quiz you on that too. This is going to be in a quiz. So let me give you a couple of them just to make sure you got this right. So let's go to our piano. Give me a major third up from F. What is a major third up from F? Remember, it needs to encompass how many alphabet letters? It needs to have some kind of F. It needs to encompass G, not that you're playing it, and then it needs to end on some kind of A, because that will have 3 alphabet letters encompassed. If it ends on a G, it's not right. If it ends on a B, some kind of B, it's not right. So it needs to pass that test. And it needs to have 4 half steps, because a major third is 4 half steps. So you should have got A, because F to F sharp to G, G to G sharp to A. So you should have got F and A. Remember we did this earlier, but we weren't talking about intervals then. We were just talking about half steps. Now you know that this is a major third. Now how do you make this a minor third? You just lower the A to an A flat. But here's the trick, gospel musicians. Don't change the alphabet letter. Because what happens when you change the alphabet letter, y'all? You're not playing a third no more. Because it's going to either change how many alphabet letters are in the mix, or it's going to increase it or decrease it. And in this case, if you change this to G sharp, you only have an F and a G now. F, G. Nothing in between it. It's only 2 alphabet letters. Therefore, it's called a second. It's an augmented second, a totally different term. Okay, so you don't want to do that. You want to keep the alphabet letters when you're moving between major thirds and minor thirds. Alphabet letters should be consistent. Okay, let's see. How about from B? What's a major third up from B? Remember the test. What are you going to call this? Okay. What are you going to call it, though? Here's why you can't call this an E flat. Because if you call this an E flat, how many alphabet letters are between B and E flat? Well, you got B, you got some kind of C, you got some kind of D, and then you got E, E flat in this case. That's 4 alphabet letters, which makes it a fourth. And I didn't ask you for a fourth. I mean, you could have called this a fourth, but I didn't ask for a fourth. I asked for a third. So it needs to have some kind of B and some kind of D, and that's going to be a D sharp. Okay? It has 1, 2, has the 4 half steps that we need. It sounds like a happy major third, and it is a major third. If you want to make it a minor third, remember it's 3 half steps, so you just lower this D sharp to D. And now you have a more serious minor third. Okay? Let's do another one. Let's see. How about right here? What do you call this? I need a minor third up from this. F sharp. Minor third up. Answer should be A. Okay? And here's the other thing. Yeah, the answer should be A, pretty much. And some people say, well, how do I know what worlds I want to be in? Well, here's an example, okay? Because most minor chords begin with minor third intervals. You're going to learn this in the next segment in the Chord County DVD. But usually, if you're going to be in minor, you're going to be in F sharp minor instead of G flat minor. Remember I said every black key has 2 notes? Why wouldn't you want to be in G flat minor? Well, what would be a minor third up from G flat? Tell me. What would be a minor third? What would be a minor third up from G flat? What would be the answer? Would it be A? That's incorrect. G flat and A? How many alphabet letters are in G flat between G and A in the alphabet? It only encompasses 2, G and A. We need 3. We need some kind of G, some kind of A, some kind of B. So by saying G flat and A, that would be wrong. You have to take this B over here. You not only have to flat it 1 time, but you have to flat it 2 times. And that's what we call double flatting. And you don't want to do all that. That's crazy. So immediately when I come across a key that has crazy stuff going on and I want to be correct, I move to the other key, and usually the other key is going to be easier. So F sharp, you don't have to do double flats and stuff. It works with the interval rules. It works with all the half step, whole step stuff, the major third, the generic intervals. It all works. But as soon as you move to calling out a G flat minor, now you have to say G flat and B double flat. You don't want to have to do that. So that's another glimpse at how to know what to call your different keys and how to know what key you like to play in. Obviously, if we don't ever have to tell anybody what key we're in, it's going to sound the same whether I'm in the key of C sharp or D flat. But in terms of being correct and what to name it, that's when this stuff comes to play, and you pick the key that's easier.